for air and the sweetly sick smell of old alcohol and fresh vomit, and just kind of experienced a deflation of my desire. I went for a walk instead, and when the nightmares came back to me, when the wounds opened up and felt fresh and the people in my life I'd let die hovered before me, I'd take off on a little trot to make them go away. I had gone from figuratively running from my dreams to literally running from them. Eventually, I'd make it back home. Still hadn't had a drink, these 6 months since I'd absconded from Lumber Junction. It was like I got a new shot at being lucky, I said at my first meeting, and even though it didn't make a whole lot of sense, that feeling kind of stuck with me. Winston ran the meetings I attended, and he had this saying about my experience. You don't leave the house looking for a drink unless you really want it. And it doesn't sound like you really want it. That wasn't luck, it was a choice, and you made the right one. Day by day, you just don't drink anymore. That's it. Isn't any luck to it. Guess he's right, most days. But sometimes, I thought he was just making me feel better. And he was a good man, family man, raised his daughter Yaelis by himself. I kept up with him about as much as I'd ever done with my own family. And sometimes they invited me over for dinner. It was a nice break from eating alone with the dog staring up at me, licking his chops. Somebody rented me a nice little place near downtown, and though I mostly think that it was a stroke of luck too, it was not entirely uncommon for me to hear gunfire in the middle of the night. Sometimes it ripped me from my dreams of seeing men burned alive, of being near death myself, watching the world around me engulfed in flames. Other times, however, I was already up, peering through open blinds into the night, black as a cup full of Coca-Cola, another thing I'd become reacquainted with in my newfound sobriety. Even though I couldn't sleep, the staring wasn't about insomnia. The sixth sense I used to possess, in which dead people got up and gave good conversation to me, still hadn't entirely vanished. I expected something, I reckon. In my head, I had a vision of a man trundling down a tree-lined walkway straight for me, his eyes cold and dark and ready for dealing death. Didn't have to be a dead man, probably wouldn't be a dead man, but nevertheless, I expected someone to come for me, and my only hope was that I'd be ready for him when he did. A couple of close calls had sent me rifling through my bedside drawer for my .45. False alarms, old drunks stumbling back home to their modest little houses, tilting this way and that, but managing to stay upright. The gunfire never bothered me, but the men in the old suits set my skin to dancing around on me. One of these days, I was in the habit of thinking it won't be a man in an old suit stinking of jug wine that will be walking down the path. Be ready for that, unless you want to join the cavalcade of the dead you've created. Other new things, I don't know. I got a TV with some screen burn in, so every show looked like it was advertising a Fast and Furious movie. It's all right. I don't watch much more than the Braves anyway, and they didn't make it to October this year, so the television looks like little more than an oversized knick-knack. And the dog, too, Willie the Mutt. Not much of a guard animal, spends most of the time on the bed I bought him, eyeing me with his cloudy gaze like I owe him something, but overall not a bad dog either. Guess I'm just not used to something depending on me. Got a new phone, not a flip phone either. I upgraded and got something like an iPhone, but not quite as fancy. Still, couldn't make the damn thing work very well. I'm only in my late 30s, but I've reached the age where technology has left me bereft and confused. Mostly I call people on it. I text some too, though I'd prefer not to. After I contemplated the fortune of my circumstances, new phone and all the dead bodies and whatnot, I put my legs beneath me and tried to run home. They felt rubbery and loose for the task, so I walked the majority of it. I still hadn't figured out the process for getting music onto my new phone, so no old blues or 80s metal for me. Instead, I allowed the sound of the wind through the trees to push me forward. Down the sidewalk and up the steps of my tiny new house sent me to my first truly unsettling moment in the place. I heard Willie barking even before I saw the destruction. I'd only ever heard him bark that way when he saw, or mostly smelled since he was largely blind, another dog he found disreputable. I couldn't get the key in the lock fast enough, and when I got inside, I was greeted with what might have been an ominous movie scenario. Things were everywhere. Couch cushions and books had been strewn all over the living room, the stuffing of each piled like remaining snowdrifts along the living room floor. The place had been ransacked, and I might have rushed to get my .45 had I not noticed the tuft of white material dangling from my dog's snaggletooth jaws. "The hell did you do all this for?" I asked him, at which point the old dog barked. Just once, an acknowledgement of the deed. He also swiped his tail across the floor once to show his own joy and amusement at the task, but then he lumbered back to his bed and lay down, sighing like he was already over the situation. Still in my running shoes, I went about cleaning up after the bastard. Some of the stuff was mine, but most of it had been procured through some extensive shopping at the Goodwill off West Broad, so it wasn't a grievous loss. Everything had a mismatched, I've had this since I was 18 look, but I'd have to do for now. When I got out of Lumber Junction, I'd gotten out quickly. The house was sold as quickly as possible, and I left most everything there. I feared bringing all of that with me, and that it would make me more likely to relapse, which had been my primary concern. I'd fled Lumber Junction like someone was looking for me, and the more time I spent in Savannah, the more I believed that might be true. My ex-wife, Vanessa, had been involved with some nasty business and some nasty people before she died, and something told me there was a dark cloud with my name on it floating around somewhere in the world. I don't know what it was that made me look up, but I did. I'd been wiping up a tiny pea stain over by the television, the dog's favorite spot, while I reckoned something glinted out of the corner of my eye. The realization made me bolt upright. My heart played a 4/4 backbeat in my chest, double time. I hadn't seen the item in question since, hell, I couldn't remember when, and of all the things Willie had ripped up and tossed haphazardly in the living room, this couldn't have been one of them. It was a relic from the past, from a time before all the bad business in the junction, when the world was still bright and shining and in front of me. So much was behind me now, and this one thing was a simple reminder of all that could have been. On a shelf where I'd been storing the few books I'd brought with me sat Vanessa's engagement ring. "Welcome back, baby," I said to the cool morning air. Thank you for enduring that. I will be signing copies. I'll be hanging out here. If you have any questions, you can ask them now. Or as you think of them, if you want to pick up a book and peruse it. I'll be here for the next couple of hours to answer questions, sign books, and just hang out. So we got buntinis. We have lots of them. So feel free to gorge. They're red. Kate, I'm gonna out her a little bit. She loves a theme. So since this is the Devil Came Calling, she got red velvet buntinis. So devil's food cake. So we've got Prosecco and buntini. So enjoy yourselves. And I'm going to be back here. So feel free to ask questions, hang out, or talk to me. Thank you so much. Yes,
well,
absolutely.
We'll just go ahead and ask questions.
Okay, great. Please.
What are you reading now? And you're not reading Stephen King now. Who are you reading? What other writers do you like now that you're older and that you're on this journey?
That's a great question. I try to read a book a week, and recently I've been on a spate of reading trashy true crime books. So I've been reading a lot of Anne Rule recently. She wrote a book in the 70s called The Stranger Beside Me, which was about her time with Ted Bundy. I'm fascinated by that sort of stuff. I mean, in the 80s I grew up, serial killers were all the rage. Serial killers were everywhere. That was the big fear. So I sort of dipped back into that. But my favorite writer, I would have to say right now, is a guy named James Lee Burke. He came from Louisiana. He writes this series called the Dave Robichaux series. I love those books with all of my heart. And if you haven't read them, you can pick up anywhere in the series. They're sequential, but you can pick up any novel and read it, and it's fantastic. My college roommate turned me on to him when I was 20, and I love them. So James Lee Burke's someone I read a lot of. There's a writer out of New York who wrote a trilogy of books. It's called the Hank Thompson Trilogy. His name is Charlie Houston, and it's Caught Stealing 6 Bad Things in a Dangerous Man. It's about a guy. It's a wrong man plot. It's very Hitchcock. He is given some money that is not supposed to be his, and some very bad people come looking for him. And it is a phenomenal 3-part series. It's written in a very Dashiell Hammett sort of style. I've dug back into Dashiell Hammett. I just finished.
Which you do as well. I mean, you incorporate those styles in your writing as well.
And I'm trying to get to the point where I want to reach. My ultimate hero at this point is James Ellroy. I love all of his Underworld crime trilogy. I'm working my way sequentially through all of his books, and I want to get to the point where the point of writing is to carve out as much of the fat as possible. And so with the 3rd book, it's probably going to be double the size of the first 2 books. but I'm going to try to cut it down, which is what James Elroy did with one of his books. They said, this is too long, this is 900 pages. So he just took out all the verbs. And so I'd like eventually to cut it down, because not only am I a fan of reading, I'm a fan of music, and I love songwriters like Jason Isbell, and I think the essence of a novel should be able to convey an idea without over-expounding on it. And I'd like to reach the point where I can get across an idea with a sentence. I think Hemingway does that really well. I think F. Scott Fitzgerald does that really well. I read The Great Gatsby once a year, and if you read closely in The Devil Came Calling, there is an homage to The Great Gatsby in there. There's a character who is taken directly from that book. So I love Southern fiction, but I try to find people who tell the truth in a succinct way, which I don't always do. So, great question. Thank you so much. Any other questions?
Where does the supernatural come from, the elements? What's your background spiritually, being raised in the South?
So
even the criminals go to church and
right.
believe in Jesus.
They do. They usually are sweating, though. There's a big difference. So, I mean, I grew up in a largely religious family. It was all around me. I mean, it practically permeated the town. There's a joke that I make whenever I go home. Any restaurant that goes out of business, a church springs up in its place. So there's actually a fried chicken place that's now a Methodist church, and I think there are more churches than people where I grew up. So it's there. It's always around, and I've sort of dallied with, I've danced with church. I went to a Pentecostal church in high school, so I went to where the preacher would stand up and talk for a few minutes, and then someone would just there would always be a moment every Sunday where someone would just start saying things in an inconceivable language. And so people would run up and down the aisles, and it wasn't snake handling or anything like that, but it was a very intense religious experience. I mean, people were falling out, and we'd have like 4-hour church services, and sometimes I wouldn't get home until 3:30 in the afternoon. So I went through my crucible of religion, but I'm sort of agnostic to this point. At this point, it's there. But the actual ghost part of it, I think, is just a part of the South. I mean, I think as soon as people landed in Savannah, they were telling stories about things in the woods, and it goes back to the headless horseman, and Washington Irving telling stories about the headless horseman. I mean, ghosts are just a part of the American experience, and especially the Southern experience. I mean, my grandmother believed in ghosts, and my mother told me stories of ghosts, and I always loved that aspect of it. I wanted to bring it into my books, and growing up in the 80s with Stephen King did not hurt. So, but I want it to be the supernatural aspect of the books. I want to be just sort of something that glides in and out. It's not necessarily all of the plot, but I want it to be something a little different. This isn't just another sort of PI story. I'm not trying to just create a character who's just going to go from story to story. And I think it's integral. Every instance of the supernatural, I try to make integral to who this character is. It's all about who he is and how he grows as a person. And if you want to hear, I kept this sort of PG, but if you want to hear stories that I grew up with that are sort of on the R-rated side, I have plenty. So I'd be more than willing to tell those.
Well, the languages are. I said the languages are.
Yeah.
Your writing style.
Thank you.
Which is just, yes. Okay. Just
the languages are.
It's contemporary. Yeah.
Yes, it is very contemporary. My belief is that characters should talk the way that they should talk, and I try to be as realistic. And I'm not someone who talks like a lot of the characters talk in the book, although I have my moments. But I write about people who do very bad things, and so people who do bad things generally don't talk in good Christian language. So, and the third book, I'm having a struggle because there's a lot of it in it because it's all bad people. I mean, Rolson in the third book, just to give a preview without spoiling anything, he finds himself in the first book I call it a nest of snakes, and so he finds himself in a nest of snakes in the third book, and it's almost impossible for him to figure out who is good, who is bad, and who he should trust. So there's a lot of bad language in that book, and so I have to find a way. Usually what I do is I just let it, how the sentence appears in my head, I let it go on the page, and later I'll edit it out if it's inappropriate, but usually it is if it's true to the character. So I channel my inner Quentin Tarantino sometimes, I guess. So. All right, well, feel free to ask any other questions. I'll let you guys get to the Prosecco. It is chilled and ready to be popped, so feel free to grab some and grab a buntini and come get a book signed. So thank you guys so much, and thanks Parnassus, thank you Kate, Mary Coleman, Nanny, everybody. Thank you guys.